Yo, what's going on, guys? I'm Mike from MOBOX, and in this video, I'm going to be showing you how to recreate the moon Titan that is orbiting around Saturn. So it's a super cool moon, but there's two different types of photographs you see of it. One, you see standard photographs, and then the second type are sort of infrared photographs or X-ray photographs, some sort of photograph to see through the clouds, and I'm going to be kind of doing that transition here in this tutorial. Now, this was done for a video on Real Engineering a couple months ago, maybe even a couple of years ago, about the dragonfly. So you should definitely check out that video if you haven't seen that. But anyways, let's just jump in After Effects here and create this. Okay, so here we are in After Effects, and before we get started, I just want to let you know that you need to get a plugin called VC Orb. It's from Video Copilot. It's completely free. You will not be able to do this tutorial without it, but again, it's free. You could download it from their website. I'll put a link down in the description. It's basically a planet creation tool, and it's super useful. So I'm going to start by dragging in my texture. So I have this texture that I downloaded from a website. I can't remember where, but it was definitely paid for. So in the version on Patreon that you can download over there, I'll include a free texture. But I'm just going to drag this texture into my project panel. And this is not necessarily a texture of Titan, but it looks pretty close and it will do the job. So I'm going to start by dragging this down to create a new composition. And from there, I'm going to add a few things to this layer. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a tint. And I'm going to be including this on Patreon as well. This is basically a step-by-step guide on how to do this. So some of the colors that I picked from this, I'll show you which color they are, but I'm going to be pick whipping them from here. So for my black color, I want it to be sort of like a brown. And for my white color, I want it to sort of be like a light yellow. So this is the code for that. And this is the code for that. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this layer. And on this bottom one, I'm going to add a fast blur. And I'm going to set the fast blur amount to maybe 15%. And on this top layer, I'm going to hit T on the keyboard and bring the transparency down, maybe to like 30%. For the version with fast blur, I'm going to remember to pick repeat edge pixels. And then I'm going to create a layer, new adjustment layer. And I'm going to add a curves to this. And I'm going to do a fairly steep curve, something that looks like that. And I might want to adjust this brightness up or down depending on how kind of blurry I want it to look. Maybe bring this up a little bit, to maybe to 40. We can always adjust this later. And I'm going to rename this composition to color, or Titan underscore color. And I'm going to duplicate this, Control D. I'm going to name this Titan normal. And then Control D and name this Titan gloss. So I'm going to first open up the normal layer, and I'm just going to add an effect black and white. Now, to speed things up, one thing that I could have done, which I guess I can do now, is I'll delete that black and white layer, and instead I'll just delete these tints, because every effect that you have on here will increase the amount of time for rendering. So instead of adding 3 effects, I could just delete 2 because the original layer was black and white. And I might bring my opacity down to like 30 on this one. And for my gloss layer, I'm going to be doing the same thing. I'm going to delete my tints. But I'm going to add an effect called invert. So I'm going to invert those colors. And I'm going to add a brightness and contrast. And I'm going to bring up the contrast quite a bit on my gloss layer. Now I could just close all of those, and I'm going to start with my new composition, which is my main comp. I'm going to make it 1920 by 1080. 25 frames per second is good for me. 10 seconds is perfect. So I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to drag all 3 of these into my composition, and I'm going to make them invisible. Next thing I'm going to do is create a layer new solid. And for the color of this layer, I'm going to want it to be sort of like an orangish color, but the exact number I want is C5A, C5F, which is kind of like this light orange, medium yellow solid. And I'm just going to make that one invisible as well. Next, layer new solid, and I'm going to make it black, and this is going to be my background. gonna rename this to background. Okay, so now we can start creating the planet. Layer, new solid again, and I'm gonna name this Titan or planet. Yours might be different. And I'm just gonna change the color just so the icon next to it looks a little different. And I'm gonna make it maybe, I don't know, orange. And I am going to add VC orb onto this layer. So right off the bat, you can kind of see what we get. And at this stage, I'm gonna set up the lighting because it makes it a little bit easier as I go through to kind of see the lighting and kind of get the mood going. So I'm gonna add a camera. 35mm is fine. And add a light. And I'm gonna make sure that this is set to parallel. Hit OK. And if I come down here and set the view to 4 views, I could reposition this light a little bit better. I'm gonna bring it over, bring it up, and maybe get a nice angled light like that. So this is my active camera. So it just takes some getting used to using the 4 view. I know I went through that pretty fast, but it just separates it from the left view, the side view, the top view, and so it makes it a little bit easier to position things in 3-dimensional space. Okay, so let's jump into this VC orb and start adjusting some settings. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to input my map layers. Basically, these are the planet textures, the glossiness layers, and they must be in the composition for you to use them. So for my diffuse layer, which is my color layer, I'm just going to select color. For my gloss layer, I'm going to pick gloss. For my illumination layer, I'm also going to pick gloss, but for my bump layer, I'm going to select the normal map. Now, if you applied effects to these layers in this panel, you'll need to change this to effects and masks, but I didn't do that, so I don't need to adjust any of those settings. Okay, so I'm gonna bring up the size to maybe 300, the radius, just so I get a better picture of what I'm looking at. And I'm gonna start adjusting some of these settings. Now, there's a great tutorial by Video Copilot on what all of these settings does, and how to adjust them perfectly. But I'm just gonna go through the settings that I changed, and I'm gonna go a little bit fast through them. But I hope that you understand. I'm not going to explain exactly why I'm changing these, but just notice that I'm changing these. The reason being is that honestly, when I'm using a lot of plugins or when I'm doing a lot of stuff in After Effects, it's mostly trial and error. So although this is a step-by-step guide on how to create Titan, truth be told, it took many hours to adjust these settings to get the look that I was looking for, mostly because I'm not an expert in every single aspect of the program and every aspect of the plugin. Sometimes it just takes some time to adjust some of the settings to see what you end up getting that best matches what you're trying to visualize. At times, you end up finding stuff that you weren't even intending to visualize. So that's some of the cool things about just messing with the settings and not being too critical about getting the exact settings to match what I'm doing. So for my diffuse, I'm going to bring this down to maybe like 0.7. For my glossiness, I'm going to bring this up to maybe 0.5. For my specular, I'm going to do 0.2. For my reflectivity, I'm going to do 0.6. My illumination, I can leave at 0. And for my ambient and opacity, I could leave those at 1. And my illumination options, I don't think I need to change anything there. But for these maps, I'm going to change a lot of these settings. So I'm going to bring this up to like 2.5, maybe 1.8, and then maybe we'll just leave that one at 1. So I'm changing the color. And so this is the gamma, which is kind of how crunchy, think of it like the curves adjustment, which that looks kind of cool in itself. Not the look we're going for. Brightness would be how bright you're making that, that color layer. And then the blend would be how much you're blending between the two. So while we're here, I'm going to hit Control S to save this. So I'm just going to save that just so we don't lose anything. For my gloss layer, I'm going to set this to like 5.5 and then maybe 3. This layer I'm going to adjust, or this setting I'm going to adjust later because I'm basically making these dark sections oceans. For my illumination layer, I'm going to set this to maybe like 1.7 and then maybe just like 0.1. So we can see that those settings don't really make a massive difference. And then for my bump layer, I'm going to set this down to like 0.5 because it's pretty bumpy. So this setting obviously increases the bumpiness. So that looks pretty cool. And when I rotate this, you can see that it gets glossy wherever there are dark areas. So it looks like there's like oceans sort of on the surface, which I think looks pretty cool. Okay, so now we can just add a few more effects to this. I'm gonna add a brightness and contrast, or you could use a curves, but I'm gonna set this to like maybe -90 and then +70. So I'm gonna get a really kind of contrasty image. And I'm going to set a color balance on this as well. And I'm gonna increase the saturation very high. Now, this obviously took a lot of trial and error, but I'm going to be compositing a lot of different layers on top of one each. I'm going to be adding a lot of layers on top of each other with various levels of opacity and blending modes. So this looks obviously very crazy right now. Once I start adding additional layers on, you'll see what it looks like. And I might need to adjust these. You know, obviously 100 is pretty high. Maybe I set this to, I don't know, 70. And we could always come back and adjust these later. So next I'm going to create my first cloud layer. And so since Titan has multiple different colors to it, it kind of has like a yellow, orange, and then it also has a weird blue green tint around the outside. I'm going to be getting something first that looks something green, and then I'm going to be adding on top of that something that looks yellow. So I'm going to create another layer, new solid. I'm going to name this clouds 1. I'm going to just change the color here. This will not be the color of the clouds, but just so I'm kind of differentiating the color here. And I'm going to, again, add a VC orb to this. And I'm going to bring up the radius. Remember we were at 300. I'm going to set this to maybe like 303. So just a little bit bigger. And if I hit T on the keyboard and bring this down, you could see that it's just barely bigger. I mean, I could maybe even go to 305 and adjust smaller later if I need to. Now for this layer, I'm going to be changing the illumination color to a sort of greenish color. And the code that you're looking for looks something like that, 00FFA2. Hit OK. For diffuse, I'm going to set this down to 0. For my glossiness, I'll leave it 1. For my specular, I'm going to be 0 because I don't need that like glossy, I don't need the reflection of the sun on this layer. For my illumination, this is how I'm going to get the green color. I'm going to set this like 0.2, but I need to come down into my illumination options to get rid of the area where it's dark. So for Fresnel, I'm going to set this to 1. For Fresnel bias, I'm going to set this to 2. For shadow light, 1. Shadow light contrast, 1. Shadow light expansion, 0. Bump interference, 0. Ambient, 1. Opacity, 1. So now I'm getting just basically the atmosphere color around the outside where it's atmospheric. And the farther you get to the edge, right, towards the edge, you're getting more layers of atmosphere that you're having to look through, so it's going to get darker. Now I'm going to be adding a fast blur. And I'm going to set this to like, I don't know, 15. Maybe that's a little bit too high. Maybe 10. And I'm going to add a glow. And for this glow, I'm going to be setting the change original colors to AB colors. And I'm going to set my color A to kind of a lime green and my color B to a bright blue. So you can see that it just barely changes the tonality of that just a little bit. And I'm going to leave these the same. All of that looks good. Next up, I'm going to change this blending mode to add. And I'm going to bring the transparency down to say, I don't know, 75%. And from here, I can now tell that my blur is a little bit too blurry. And my radius is a little bit too bright or too large. So I'm going to bring that down. So now let's give this planet some rotation. And now we're getting something very close. So pretty much the planet without the atmosphere, the photo without the atmosphere, we're pretty much done. Now we're going to just start adding some atmospheric effects. So I'm going to create a layer, new solid once again, clouds 2. And since my clouds are yellow, I'm just going to set the color to be sort of a yellow color. Again, this will not affect the color of the layer. It just helps me distinguish them in this panel. And for this layer, I'm going to again be adding a VC orb. And I'm going to be bringing the size up to, again, maybe 302. And for my maps, I'm going to set my diffuse layer map to my medium yellow solid, which was that color that we picked, that we made earlier. And I'm going to just adjust some of these settings. Again, I don't want any glossiness. I don't want any specular. I do want some reflectivity. Actually, that doesn't even do anything. Maybe I don't need any reflectivity. Illumination 0. Maybe increase the ambient just a bit, 1.15, and then come in here and adjust my... Anyways, I'm going to adjust my gamma value to maybe 5.4, which will make it really crunchy looking, but then increase my brightness as well to like 3.4 and leave my blend set to 1. So that's giving me a really bright orange green or bright orange coloration. And I could then bring the transparency down to maybe 80. And I could add a fast blur to this as well and maybe set that to 30 is pretty high. Maybe like 6.3. Something like that. Now I can go ahead and duplicate this layer and put it underneath the planet. Bring the opacity down. So now we're getting something that looks very close to that Titan picture, right? We're getting an orange, yellow. Obviously it's a little bit more, a little bit brighter, a little bit more coloration here. So let's actually make a few more adjustments and change things up a little bit by adding a layer new adjustment layer. Put this over the clouds. And I'm going to add a few things on this. I'm going to add a curves. So now I'm getting a lot more tonality change from this orange to this yellow, which looks cool, but the saturation is just way too high. So I'm going to also now add a color balance to this and bring the lightness down because it's very bright, maybe -5. And then bring the saturation down like -35. Maybe a little bit more than that, maybe -25. Last thing, I'm going to add just some noise to this. Maybe 8. And for my background layer, it's a little bit too dark to actually get any noise. I'm just going to lift the black just a little bit so we get some noise in the black. I guess one thing I didn't consider is when I lift the black, we're not getting any noise here. Actually, I did watch a tutorial at one time to see how you add noise to darker areas, but I can't ever find that tutorial anymore. Anyways, okay. So here we have something that looks basically just like Titan. Let me drag in the actual picture of Titan and we can make a little bit of a comparison and obviously make changes if we feel it's necessary. I think ours looks pretty good. It obviously doesn't look exactly the same, but I think that it looks pretty good. Ours is obviously a little bit more saturated, but we did kind of achieve some sort of blue-green hue. Maybe we want to adjust that just a little bit so it's not so green and maybe it's a little bit bluer. And our clouds might be a little bit too thick. And then our coloration is just a little bit off, but to be honest, not a big deal. We're going for a more stylized look anyway. So I think that they look pretty close. Obviously the shadow also looks a little bit off too. But next thing, let's move this camera and let's get rid of these clouds. So I'm gonna hit P on the keyboard and just set a position keyframe. And I'm gonna set an opacity keyframe for my clouds. And I'm gonna bring the camera forward. And I'm gonna bring the clouds down. And I am going to also add some rotation to this planet. So holding Alt, or let me actually add a little bit of tilt on this planet. So maybe -15. Holding Alt on rotation Y, I'm going to type value plus time. So now the planet will rotate across time, but I could also adjust the value so we get some cool reflections at that time. I'm gonna just use my motion tool here to add some speed enhancements, and you can see here that we get something that looks pretty cool. Obviously that gloss is pretty glossy. You can come into this map layer, and this is where you would adjust the glossiness. But I think that that looks pretty cool. It looks like there's water on the surface. Or not water, I guess, liquid methane on the surface. Now, one last thing you can do is you can create the layer new solid, and I'm going to make this like a bluish color. Okay, I'm just going to create a mask by double-clicking the ellipse tool. Hit T on the keyboard, bring this down. Hit M on the keyboard to do subtract. And maybe I'll scale this up a bit. Add a fast blur. Just like that. And then maybe I'll line these up to change the color. So I'll add a fill to it. We'll start with like that bluish color, putting it under the adjustment layer. And then maybe bring this to like a reddish color. Change my opacity. And then add the same smoothing. So that kind of looks like we're transitioning from a standard camera to maybe the X-ray camera. So anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to give this video a like. If you want to download the project file, you can over on our Patreon account. And be sure to let us know in the comments down below if you have any ideas for us. As always, share with us on Instagram and Twitter your final compositions that you create with this, because we're always super excited to see the different things that people come up with. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching.